Welcome to Brain Talk. Let's talk brains. Today we have Dr. Victoria Templer with us from Providence College, and she is going to talk a little bit about why living socially is good for your brain.
So I became interested in sociality. So what we mean by sociality is just being social. So how does that affect your brain? And, we've known for quite some time that living in social groups is beneficial for many species. It results in increased survival, enhanced fitness of the entire group. And more recent research is showing us that it is enhancing brain functioning. So the question that I had actually came, this was before the pandemic, before we realized how important sociality actually was kind of based on this really foundational research in neuroscience in the last maybe 10, 15 years. That is, these studies, if you put fish, if you put rats, any type of species you put in a cage. In rats, we usually house them in we call it a shoebox cage. It's a pretty small cage like a shoebox. And you house half your rats in there, and you house half the rats in a fancy cage that's like a ferret cage, much bigger. It's an enriched environment. They have access to exercise. If you look at their brains, what you see is a dramatic difference in neurogenesis. That's the creation of new neurons in the enriched environment, access to exercise, increased synaptogenesis. So that's the connections between neurons. And so we've known for a long time that these studies are just dramatic. If you expose, this is the same in humans as well. If you expose humans to enriched environments, and basically any animal species that we've tested and exercise, their brains are just going to be much healthier. So it's neurally protective against cognitive decline due to aging. So we've always known exercise, environmental enrichment is really, really good for your brain, right? So we should all be exercising if you're not, and exposing yourself to new experiences, new contexts. That's a great thing that we can all do for our brains. But my question was about sociality. So if we sort of disentangle the exercise and the environmental enrichment, how fancy your cage is, how big it is, how many different objects are in it. So what I did is I housed rats in conditions where they were both enriched, they both had access to exercise, but one were socially housed. So rats living all together, 10 male rats living all together, and then 10 male rats living individually, but also in the fancy, nice cages. And what we saw really interestingly, which hadn't been found before, and Victoria actually helped me with these studies, so she can add in whatever I've missed, which I'm sure I'm missing many things, is that those rats housed in the social environments were protected against working memory errors. So what's a working memory error? A working memory, I guess the key thing about working memory is that it's active. It's what you have to keep sort of in your mental kind of desktop. Think of your desktop on your computer right now. What's in that working memory space? And so you're using your working memory if, say, Pablo tells you his telephone number and you're repeating it to yourself. So you keep repeating it to yourself. That's using a part of working memory called your phonological loop. And so we use working memory all the time. Say you're in your bedroom and you walk down to your kitchen, and then you say, you kind of ask yourself, why did I come into this room? This happens to me all the time, but you're kind of remembering what you need to do. That's kind of like prospective memory, and what you just did. So yes, I already got, something out of this room, and now I need to go into this room so I can leave the house. That's your working memory. And we gave rats a task where we had them in a maze, and they had to kind of remember what they just did and what they need to do so they can access particular arms in something called a radial arm maze. And what we found is that those that were housed in the social environment, and remember, environmental enrichment was equal across groups, were protected against those working memory errors. So those rats that were housed individually didn't have their pals all around with them in their cage throughout development. They experienced much more working memory errors. And again, that's just like having more times where you walk into a room in your house and you don't remember why you went in there. So we were excited to find that, because that hadn't been found before when you kind of divorced the environmental enrichment and exercise and just looked at the sociality alone. So I can answer definitely more questions about that. There's lots to talk about. But I think the main message here is that sociality is really important and healthy for our brains. It's protective on a neural level, and I can talk about more about the molecular neuroscience and how we have evidence for that. And I can also talk about the cognition in terms of the outcomes that we saw in those rats.
Yeah, thank you, Vicki. That's awesome. So basically, as you're saying this, I have this mental image of a 5-star luxury hotel, right? And you have the person who came by themselves to the 5-star luxury hotel to get away from everybody, and the one that came with like their whole family and they're all like piled up in one room. And so what you're saying is the one that came and piled up all in one room, they're probably better off cognitively.
I don't know what to say about vacations. I don't want to rank vacations or how I think those are personal, preferences, but yeah, I don't know. That's a funny question.
Yeah. But so in general, right? In general, if we live our lives in a more secluded format, which, some people say that they like, right? During pandemic, even people who are so super social were more than happy to put on their PJs and not look at another human soul for 3 months, right? And so even though we report liking it, it might still not be good for us, even though we're enjoying it.
Yeah. It's so interesting because, and I think the pandemic has brought out so much. I mean, in terms of the extent to which we all are introverts versus extroverts or some sort of a combination. And sometimes you just need to be alone. And so, the pandemic has taught us so much, I think. And I do think that regardless of, yes, some people need more alone time, some people need more sociality. It is by definition true that if you are engaged in social interactions, your brain releases something called oxytocin, a neuropeptide that is a feel-good type of chemical in our brain, and also dopamine. So, our brain, it is healthy for our brains to be around people face to face, no matter what, even if you're an introvert or an extrovert.
Right. And interacting with them, right? Because the key part of what you talked about was that, all of these different rats were in separate cages, and presumably they could see the rats in the other cages, right? It's not that they didn't see that there were other individuals out there,
Right.
But they couldn't interact with them, right? And so that's like us in our houses, yes, we can, kind of say hi to the person across the street, but if we're not interacting with them, then we're not benefiting cognitively from that.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, because a lot of the studies previously in terms of rats had looked at social isolation, where you literally put them like in a cooler so you can't see, smell any other rats. And that is not what we did. So really what we were modeling, we didn't even know it, was, as you age, there's some people that are engaged in communities and seeing people all the time. And there's some that are not, more like we were during the pandemic, where you see people in the grocery store perhaps, but you're not really interacting with them. And you're right that interaction piece is, has differences. It has, differences in our brain, and really, there's so many things that affect our cognitive aging, right? There's obviously genetic factors, but there's also a lot we can do to try to slow the eventual cognitive decline due to aging, even if we don't suffer from dementia.
Right. And this, I will point out, has been seen in human studies, right? So if, again, I worked with Dr. Templer, so I'm a little bit familiar with the work, but the studies that we have in humans are very correlational, right? And so can you talk to us a little bit about how your work kind of improved upon that based on what we know from humans?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And also I encourage you, I think Dr. Hamer McGinn is giving a talk on the use of animals. But yeah, so there's been observational studies in humans that have showed, for example, a positive correlation between sociality and memory functioning. So we know, for example, that those in healthy marriages are less likely to suffer from dementia. And a lot of these studies are epidemiological, so they're helpful and they're interesting, but they're also kind of riddled with confounding variables. We don't know anything about the life histories of these people, so they don't really give us a model by which we can isolate the cognitive and the neural processes that cause this dissociation between memory function and memory dysfunction. to result from different levels of sociality. So obviously the human studies are hugely important, and we need both. But if we really want to answer really specific questions, I think that animal models are really important I think they give, I hate to say this, I know we have another animal research here, but I think they give better answers. I think the questions are better in the human studies, but I think the answers are actually better in the animal studies, because we can just get more specific. Yeah. So we need both, but I think that's why I wanted to study it in animals, is because we can control everything. Mm-hmm. We can make everything completely equal in their lives. And if I'm looking at aging, the rat's going to age in 3 years. So I have the equivalent of a 90-year-old human in 2.5 years. So I can track everything and keep everything completely equal to really look at what are those differences across our groups, social or non-social, or whatever my independent variable is.
So I'm very interested in what happens if, say, in the mouse model or in any rodent model, on humans, if someone has been an introvert for a long time and then they become an extrovert, right? Do you see that jump in cognition over time? I imagine there's going to be a ramp up time where initially probably going to be a lot of, anxiety and everything to become more sociable. Because I'm thinking about this in multiple contexts, also like people that are in solitary confinement, when they come out there, is it good to help them, make them more sociable, teach them skills to cope with, to become more sociable? And is that going to help them long term?
That's such an interesting question. I wish I had a good answer. And I feel like the answer you'd need somebody that's an expert in, personality, which I'm not. But I assume this research must be being done, because there are, people that are released from solitary confinement, and you do want to, help them make that shift. And what are the conditions that can kind of facilitate that shift? But I don't know how flexible, throughout a lifetime, generally introversion versus extroversion is.
And I would imagine that there's some sort of, as all of you know, of course, our brain has plasticity, which is the ability to be flexible, right? When your environments change and your behavioral needs change, your brain will change accordingly, like physically change. And so, yeah, I mean, the question is really interesting to me, right? Like how neuroprotective is sociality in terms of our ability to recover, right? And what I think of is drug addiction, right? So one of the biggest predictors of whether somebody will recover from a drug addiction is having a supporting family, a supporting network of family and friends, right? Yeah. So just based on that tells us something, that being around other people is good for your brain. It's good for how smart you are, but it's also good for how adaptable you are. So yeah, absolutely. Taking that, if there's one take-home message you take today, is you have to be around other people if you want to be a successful human being who can make changes for yourself. You can't do it alone, right? You need a support system, you need a mentor, you need a family around us.
The same thing happens with pregnant women. The immigrant paradox of women crossing the border pregnant, with a family that supports them. They have better outcomes than their children and their grandchildren. And the theory is that it is that socialization. I mean, all the effort of an immigrant family when somebody is pregnant is towards that pregnancy. And once, you're here in the United States, that social interaction also decreases. There's a question on the chat that great minds think alike. I had the same question.
Great transition.
It's about whether you observe gender differences in the social living, and how does it affect rats. But my question was not just on rats, on humans. Are there any gender differences? Because, as we know, women tend to be more social than men. And as especially as we age, and I've been reading a lot about developing. I'm in a group of men just basically to counteract the typical macho. I'm not going to talk about my feelings or say anything, and how that social interaction is different between men and women.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that the needs are different. We know in humans, females often need a little more social interaction, but there's so much variability, right? Like we talked about the extent to which people are introverts versus extroverts. I unfortunately only tested males, I have to admit, in these series of studies. I would love to test females and males. It just becomes more complicated, and there's more groups, and then you'd need a female group and a male group and not mix them. But it's a fabulous question. It should be addressed.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, I know this is not sort of the purpose of this, but that's one thing that I really want to call out, because as Brain Week Rhode Island, one of the things we're trying to do is raise awareness. And yes, there is absolutely a need in science to increase the inclusion of female rodents, right?
Mhm.
So in the 90s, I believe it was, we basically introduced legislation so that in clinical trials, it was required to include women, right? Before then, trials included it, but it wasn't required. And that's great, right? We know that there are clinical differences in terms of how diseases manifest. We know that there's clinical differences in terms of how we respond to treatment. We know that there are behavioral differences overall. But if we don't test in female rodents, and this is where we get all of our knowledge for human medical conditions, then that's kind of a gap. So yes, thank you, Dr. Frimple. Definitely that's something that's really important to bring up.
And likewise, longevity. How about longevity? Does the social interaction improve the longevity of rats?
That's a great question. I'm not sure. My guess is yes. I know that the overall health and longevity and cognitive health was improved. We know is improved by diet. So these animals were on a very healthy diet. They were not fed ad lib, we call, which is eat as much as you want.
They were not going to McDonald's.
They were not going to McDonald's. So we know that all of the rats I talked about in this particular study were in enriched conditions. So that definitely increased overall health and longevity and mental health, because they were in the enriched conditions and because they were on, a healthy diet. But if sociality alone could, increase longevity, I would say yes, honestly, from the studies in humans as well. I mean, there's all these studies about the super agers, if you guys have heard about that, where they have, the humans living in their retirement homes that are pretty active. And usually those people, the super agers, they call them, are, I think that the social environment that the people are in improves overall health and therefore longevity. And also those correlational human studies that I was talking about as well. We've known for a long time that just having those living in social conditions does, increase outcomes for hypertension and immune system responses. There's all sorts of other epidemiological studies that have pointed to that.
I wonder, so actually based on that, and I remember you and I talking about this a while ago, what are the main sort of predictors or things that people have in common who are super agers?
So I remember hearing someone talk about this at a conference I went to. And I think it was, the social the social environment.
Yeah.
Everybody else should jump in if you guys remember.
Diet definitely was one, right?
Diet.
So having, not necessarily like being on a diet, but eating healthy, right?
Yes,
The old school, like every one thing of each color on your plate kind of thing.
Right. And I think I remember the person that was on that study gave a talk I heard once, and they looked at everything. They looked at vitamin D. They looked at every possible vitamin you could take.
Right.
They found nothing. I remember her saying that they found, that moderate amounts of caffeine and sometimes moderate amounts of alcohol are actually beneficial.
I remember that. I wanted you to say it, not me, but yeah.
So that those, it could be, those again is not causation. That's probably more correlation. So perhaps those that are, have caffeine or have a drink at the end of the day are, from a particular socioeconomic status or whatnot. But I remember that it was like they looked at everything, and it was basically like exercise, social environment, sociality is important, but they looked at every type of vitamin, and it was really,
Right. Yeah. So diet, social. So if you want to be a super ager, eat a good diet, exercise, and hang out with friends.
Yeah,
right?
I think so.
So we talked a little bit about pandemic and how that has affected people. Do you know if there have been studies recently done on, at the correlational, like human level in terms of, are Zoom connections the same as a personal connection or as an in-person connection, right?
Yeah.
Throughout pandemic, we were all isolated, but we tried our best. Like, what has that done to our brains?
Or is it better? Is Zoom better than isolation? Is that a significant jump?
Right. Is there like a grade kind of?
Yeah, it's such a good question. Everybody else should jump in if you guys know. I don't know of any studies off the top of my head. I know my students did a study on mask wearing and how that affects emotional perception.
Yeah.
They actually didn't find dramatic differences. It was more, angry versus sad, I think was, more difficult, but on the whole, it didn't really change emotional perception. They looked at it in strangers versus friends.
Right.
Yeah, in terms of Zoom, I would guess that, Zoom is obviously better than nothing, but it's definitely not the same. I mean, we all feel it. We were on Zoom for so long, that there's a certain, you're just not going to get as much dopamine from here as if we were all in a room together. You're not going to get those, hits of dopamine and oxytocin. It's just not as rewarding.
Yeah, no, and I would imagine, at the beginning of pandemic, it was really exciting, right? Because we were like, oh my God, it's apocalypse. We're all like in our pajamas and, whatever. And let's have Zoom calls. For my family, we started a Zoom call that was, every day at 12 o'clock, we would have lunch together. And then we had it every Wednesday with my cousins, right? And that was really exciting. And like you're talking about dopamine and endorphins, right? And for me, that was so exciting. It was so novel that it probably did make up for a lot of lost in-person contact, because I was getting that sort of that rush that you need, right? But then as time went by, like you said, people got Zoom fatigue, and then it stopped being so exciting. So yeah, it probably did affect our brains, right? In terms of it's not better than in person. I would also think that in person, there's and Pablo, maybe you can speak to this more as a physician, but contact, right? Physical contact is so important to the social aspect. Yeah, go on.
Great mind thinks alike. That's what I was going to talk about. That and bringing in a cultural context. You and I as Puerto Ricans, we touch. We talk with our entire body, and want the body of the other person to talk with us. Right. So it becomes very, very difficult for flat screens to give us the same degree of endorphins, like you said.
Even in babies, right, Paula? Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, no, absolutely, and that's one of the things that we learned in obstetrics. As soon as you deliver the baby, in the past we used to grab the baby, take it back to a table so it could be examined, and all sorts of things, and wipe them up and clean them up. And we discovered that no, the best thing for the baby is to pull them right on top of the mom. Even if the mom is asleep, during a cesarean, it doesn't matter. The reactions, the everything about that baby is completely different when they have that touch immediately after birth.
So take home message: love your friends because they make you smarter.
And love your wife and your husband or your partner or your significant other, also because they're with you all the time.
Presumably they're your friends too, though, right?
I saw a phrase that I really like. It says friends with cognitive benefits.
I like it.
I like that. Friends with cognitive benefits. I'm going to write that down.
Well, on that note, thank you so much, Mickey.